Hello. Thank you so much for tuning in to this month's episode of HR in the Dark, the podcast, the video podcast that uncovers the dark side of HR, where we talk about a lot of the things that happen in the human resources world that most people might hear about but don't really want to talk about. We're going to talk about it here on this podcast. I am your host, Stephanie Lomax, President, CEO, and HR strategist for HR Pro for You, HR consulting firm that helps employers embrace HR. So this month we are talking about size matters. Why does size matter when it comes to small businesses? Specifically, why it matters as it relates to human resources issues. And so we're going to talk about, most importantly, some of the lesser known or understood laws that businesses that are small, regardless of whether you have one employee or 15 employees, are required to follow in terms of HR federal laws. Remember that even though there are federal laws that are required to be followed, there are also specific state and local laws that you may also be required to follow. So we're going to talk about 5 in particular. Again, some of them are known, some of them are not so well known, but not knowing that you have to follow them is not an excuse, and the law doesn't really care. They will fine you regardless. So let's jump right in. First is the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection. Basically, the purpose of this law is to let employers, is to inform employers that in regards to all of their employment decisions, that's hiring, firing, promotion, retention, transfer, demotion, it has to be done regardless of status of class or protected class. So those decisions have to be made, and they cannot be made based on gender, race, ethnicity, religion, any of those protected classes that fall under Title VII, Civil Rights Act of 1964. You can find more information on that under Title VII. The act is actually, or the law is actually governed by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EOC, and you can find information out specifically in regards to exactly what it means in terms of adverse impact. I can tell you briefly, without going into a lot of detail, is that you cannot have an employment selection criteria or an employment selection process. And again, that's not just hiring, but that's firing, that's promoting, demoting, transferring, training even. You cannot have an employment selection process that has an adverse impact on one particular protected class. That also includes when you do testing, for example. A lot of employers take candidates through a testing process as part of the pre-employment process. If there's adverse impact, meaning if it adversely affects one protected group over another, then that is a violation of this particular law. So you want to make sure that you don't have any of that happening in your employee selection process. The second one that we want to talk about, which is probably a little more well-known, but is often misapplied, is the Federal Labor Standards Act of 1938, also known as FLSA. And FLSA is governed by the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. Again, it was enacted in 1938, and its sole purpose is to govern and ensure equality as it relates to payment of overtime, payment of minimum wage, and to make sure that employees are receiving fair pay, whether that's full-time or part-time employees. It was originally started as a result of the Great Depression and the Industrial Revolution, where employers were not paying people overtime, requiring them to work a ridiculous amount of hours. They were paying people below the minimum wage, which is way lower, obviously, back in the 1930s than it is right now. What's important to understand about FLSA as it relates to minimum wage and overtime is, in regards to minimum wage, there's a federal minimum wage, but again, a lot of states also have minimum wages. And so an employer is required to follow whatever is most generous to the employee. So make sure, yes, you need to know what the federal minimum wage is, but in your state, you also need to know what the minimum wage is so that you are paying them properly in terms of the minimum wage rate. In addition, as I mentioned, FLSA also governs overtime. So how overtime is paid and how the employees are classified, whether they're eligible for overtime, non-exempt, or they are not eligible for overtime as an exempt employee. And one other really key point to this is that you need to make sure you actually have your employees classified correctly. Are they an employee, and should they be subject to W-2 wages, or are they a 1099 contractor? All of this falls under the wage and hour division, specifically with the FLSA law. Violations for not being in compliance with this law is back wages, back pay, penalties that are a percentage of the wages they should have gotten. If you have someone classified as a contractor and they should have been classified as an employee, you're gonna have to pay back Social Security wages and all of that stuff. And it can get to be really, really expensive. So you wanna make sure you understand the law and that you apply it appropriately as it relates to minimum wage, overtime, and then of course making sure you have employees classified properly. All right, number 3, the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Originally signed into law by John F. Kennedy, amended in 2010 by President Obama, also now known as the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act. If you have not read her story, I suggest that you do. If you did not get an opportunity to watch CNN over the last couple of weeks, where they did the story on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she talks about, Lilly Ledbetter's actually on the show, and she talks about kind of what her story was and what happened, and how Ginsburg was really instrumental in helping to have that passed, equal pay for equal work. So the Equal Pay Act is basically states that employers have to pay men and women equally for the same work. If they have the same education, the same training, the same job skills, and they carry out the same job requirements, they have to be paid the same. The old saying is that, you know, for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes 75 cents, something like that. So this law is intended to abolish discrimination as it relates to gender-based pay. If the Equal Pay Act is violated, worst case scenario, you end up in court fighting it and spending, as an employer, tons of dollars, not to mention your reputation for being a discriminatory employer is going to be, you know, in effect. But, you know, at a minimum, you're going to have to pay equal wages to those or that person that was violated against in terms of not being paid equal pay. So you want to make sure that you have documentation for why a man is being paid more than a woman. If they're doing something different, that's fine. If they have more education, that's fine. They have more experience, that's fine. It just needs to be documented, and vice versa as well. So just make sure that you understand that and know how to apply that within your small business. Number 4 is the Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, also known as USERRA. What is all of that? So USERRA is designed, or was enacted, to enforce and protect military, both active and reserve military personnel that were called to active duty in the course of their regular employment. So there, unfortunately, were employers who, when a uniformed service member was called to active duty, they would not reemploy them when they returned from their tour of duty. And that's a violation of the law. It is enforced by the Department of Labor. And in essence, what has to happen, there are some specific guidelines based on how long the military service person was deployed on active duty, as to how long they have to return, how long they have to come back to work after they return from their tour of duty. But it is very clear that anyone that goes out on military duty, that's out serving active duty, is required to be reemployed upon their return. And then lastly, let's go back. So in terms of violations of this, you're going to likely be required to pay back benefits because, of course, if they lose their benefits, you're going to have to pay those back. You, as a minimum, at a maximum, not only are you going to have to pay the wages back and pay back benefits that were lost, but you may also have to reemploy them anyway. So the best thing to do, make sure that you follow the law, and then you don't have any of those things to worry about. And then lastly is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It was passed in 1970. The FCRA is governed by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, and this was passed to ensure fairness and accuracy as it relates to the privacy of personal credit information. Now, most people think that this just has to do with credit reporting agencies, but that's actually not the case. This also includes any type of information that you pull on someone's background check. And a lot of employers are using background checks as part of a pre-employment process. Totally fine. Nothing wrong with that. A couple things need to happen. Number one, it needs to be stated in their offer letter that they will be subject to a background check. Secondly, the authorization forms need to have passed Federal Trade Commission compliance requirements, and most third-party organizations that offer the service have that packet and that information outlined. So you'll have to provide that to them, and the employer or the employee or the candidate will have to sign off on their authorization that they are authorizing you to pull that information. Some background checks do include credit information. Some background checks do not include credit information. However, the authorization covers the full gamut. So in the event you don't have to have two separate authorization processes, it covers everything, regardless of whether you're pulling credit or you're not pulling credit. But we just want to make sure that employees are aware of their rights. In the event that adverse information comes back, and you need to make some type of employment action on that information that you receive, you again have to let them know what their rights are, provide them with contact numbers and information and as to who to call so that they can either dispute the information or find out what was on it. It does happen. There's incorrect information that is on there. No system or process is perfect. But we are required as employers to provide that information to them so that they know what their rights are under the Federal Credit Reporting Act. Those are 5. That's not all, though. These are the most common. Some of, as I mentioned, some of them people are aware of, and some of them there are employers that are not. So we wanted to make sure we get this information out to you. If you are unsure as to how to apply these things into your small business, we definitely want you to reach out to us. You can contact us by email at or website at www.hrpro4you.com to schedule a 15-minute discovery call consultation so that we can take a look at what your processes are. And then secondly, we definitely want you to also take advantage of the podcast. Not just this one, this is episode number 9. So there's 8 other episodes full of information, some of which we dig a little deeper into these particular laws that you can take advantage of. If you want to sign up for the podcast, go to www.hrpro4you.com/podcast, and you can get on the mailing list to have this podcast delivered right to your email box, generally the first Wednesday of every month. This month I was under the weather, so I postponed getting it out to you guys, but generally the first Wednesday of every month at 9:00 p.m. this airs, and we'd love to have you as a subscriber to the podcast. Make sure you share this information with other small businesses that you know that may be in need of HR consulting assistance and expertise. We would love to be able to help. Next month, we are talking about What Have You Done For Me Lately? Popular song from the 1990s, I think it was. I don't think it was the 80s. Maybe it was. Maybe I'm dating myself. I don't know. But What Have You Done For Me Lately is all about helping employees understand their benefits that are being offered, probably very underutilized and often misunderstood. So we're going to talk about small businesses, how they can better communicate and include benefits that employees really want these days. And let me tell you, it's not just medical insurance anymore, not just dental or vision. There's a lot of other benefits that employees, particularly the millennials, are looking to take advantage of, and how you can incorporate those benefits into your small business for not as much money as you may be thinking it would cost. So we'll talk about that next month. It airs October 3rd, 9:00 p.m. right here. We look forward to seeing you then. Until then, let us help you embrace HR. If you have questions, certainly you know how to reach us. Look forward to seeing you next month. Bye now.